In this video, I'm going to talk about all of the different useful form inputs that we have in HTML. Now, a form is useful to get any information from the user on a website. So you could have the user type into a text box, choose something from a list, or allow them to check as many as they'd like from a list. You could also do a drop-down box, of course, or a full text box where they can type a little essay. And then there are all these cool newer ones that have come out in the last 2 years or so of a special way to create, or a different way, I guess, to create drop-down boxes called a data list, a number picker, so it will only let you put numbers in, and you can even specify what range the numbers are allowed to be in, a date picker, which is built right into HTML5, text boxes that will check and verify that you've entered a valid email address, a valid phone number, a valid URL. And so we want to talk about how to create forms with each of these types of inputs. The first and most common by far is just a little text box where you can type in whatever you'd like. And so to create that, just the text box itself, it's a single tag. It's not an opened and closed tag like most of our HTML tags are. It's just a single tag called input, and the type is what tells it that it's a text box. So if you put type equals text in quotes, it creates a text box. The name, which you'll see for all of these, is actually very important when you go to process the form, whenever you're trying to use the user input for something. And so here, if I want to refer to later the text that someone has entered into this form, I will refer to it as example text box. Whatever is stored in this text box will be stored essentially in a variable called example text box. For something that's a little different, like the radio buttons, it still is the input tag. The difference is that the type is radio. So where type equals text gives me a text box, type equals radio gives me a little choose only one radio button. And the name is what tells you these are all part of the same set of buttons. If I created a second set of radio buttons, I would have to give them a different name, or else I'd only be able to choose one out of both sets. The name is what groups these all together. Then the value is standing for which of the radio buttons you chose. So if I choose the option A radio button, what will actually be stored in my variable ratio test is first. If I choose option C, what will be stored in my variable ratio test is third. And so this value gives you the value of the variable that comes from name. An important distinction. Checkboxes work in a similar way, except that you can select more than one, of course, but the text that will show up on the screen goes after the input tag, which is right here. Inside the input tag, you specify the type. This is a little checkbox because I've typed type equals checkbox here. Whatever I check for these checkboxes will have the variable essentially be associated with the variable music, and then I've given them shortened value names, even though what shows up on the screen is I like whatever kind of music, just the music type is what gets stored in the value. For your more classical drop-down list, this is the way that it's been done before HTML5, is different. This is not another input and a type. It's called select, and it does have a start and an end tag. I tell it where the drop-down options begin with select and where they end with the end of select. And I still have to give it a name. I no longer have to give it a type because select tells it that it's a drop-down list. But I do need to give it a type, or a name, to tell it what the name of this question is, or what the name of the variable is. So this one is called drop-down example. And then for each thing in the drop-down, I specify an option. And that's another HTML tag that begins and ends, that has an open and a close. And so the first option is pick one, and that's the default that will show up when I load the page. Then I've given an option for male, an option for female, an option for other, and an option for none of your business, which I've actually called with the value MYOB, for mind your own business. And so this drop-down list has a very different setup from the previous three types. The text box is input with type text. The radio buttons are input with type radio. The checkboxes are input with type checkbox. But here the drop-down list begins and ends with select, and then each thing in the drop-down list begins and ends with option. Now, the difference between this larger text box and the original text box we saw is how many lines you're allowed to put in. And so a text box which has the tag text area, not input, but the tag text area, I can tell it the rows and columns that I want. So if I want to allow for 10 rows of text at a time to show on the screen, I can tell it the number of rows I'd like as an option within the tag. I do still have to give it a name so that I can later refer to whatever was stored in this text box. So that whatever the person types, the user types into the text box, that will get stored essentially in a variable called text box example. Now, in between the start and end text area tags, if you want to have some default text, that's what you would type. If you want it to be blank by default, you could just leave it blank. Don't put anything in between. Just put start the text area here, end the text area here, and you'd have a blank text box. For a password masking box, you can use the type of password for input. So that works very similarly to the type of text, except that instead of showing you what you type in the text box, it masks the input. This data list tag is just an alternate way of creating a drop-down box. It should work in a very similar way, but you can tell that the way that the code works is very different. Here I have select, start and end, and an option, start and end, for each thing in the drop-down list. This newer version would have a data list, start and end, and an option where the value actually goes inside the tag instead of the text being shown wrapped in the option tag before and after. The number and date and email, telephone, URL, these are newer input methods, and so some of them are supported by all of the major browsers and some of them are not. I've tried to update the list here, and so for example, date is now supported by Chrome, Edge, and Firefox, but Safari is still lagging behind a little bit on some of its versions. And according to the information I could find, email is now supported by everyone, most recently by Safari, and same with URL. And telephone number is now supported by all the major browsers. So here it should force me to have a telephone number, a valid telephone number. And here it should force me to have a valid URL. If I try and submit without a valid input, it will give me an error. Same for email. And the way you create these are very similar to the first few we saw. To create a number, you use input with type number. To create a date, you use input with type date. To create email box, you type input with type email. Telephone number, input with type tel. URL, input with type URL. And you still have to give them the names so that you know what variable to call when you want to get this input back. And the cool thing about the number one is it can give it a min and a max. And so here it won't let me select numbers other than 2 and 12 because that's exactly how I've defined it originally. Other useful attributes that you can put in, like min and max, you can tell it how big to make a text box by using size. This will be the display. You can type more, but it will only show enough room for 10. The max length is how you can limit the number of characters someone can type in. And you can just add the word required inside a form input to require that the user enter something. It will not allow it to be submitted. It will throw an error if someone tries to submit the form without entering a value. That's a broad overview of the different types of inputs allowed in forms. And so in another video, I'll go through creating a form for a specific purpose rather than just looking at the form tags in general.